I guess Solomon wants to come from the rook and listen to me last week when I said, you better do something next week, because this week he sure as hell did. He came back and he was like, yo, Arba, bitch, it's time to put you down. So definitely I gotta say, first of all, I felt a lot of responsibility was put on the shoulders of Ugo after the events of everything that went down in this arc, because if you look at it, first of all, in the beginning of this chapter, he was trusted with baby Aladdin. He's not even like, formed or anything yet. He's just a tiny little jizz specimen, he's a little embryo or whatever. So already being trusted with the life of the child of King Solomon himself, and Sheba, one of his longtime friends, looked at her probably as a little sister or something. So he was already put with that responsibility. But then at the end, when Solomon trusts him to create the new world and do all these things, it's like, I feel for Ugo, because at the end of the day, for a wise man, yeah, he's very intelligent and everything, but they just put so much pressure on this dude, and I gotta commend him for all the way up to, where he ultimately got fucked up in the arc, the Balbat arc. He really was there doing everything he possibly can to see that this kid, survives and keeps going. When Solomon returned from the Rook, I was like, hell motherfucking yeah. Now, for anybody that's trying to call BS, I mean, at the end of the day, he's practically God at that particular point. What would stop him from returning to his body? I think, though, one of the things that it did cause is his control over destiny at that particular point. Even though he wasn't really controlling it, he was letting everybody do whatever they want. He took the control basically from Il-Elah. Ultimately, it probably didn't make things any better, the fact that he wasn't there to oversee things, which technically I don't even think he could really control anything, because if he did, why wouldn't he have, controlled Arba at that particular point? So basically him coming back is mainly, I need to put this bitch down. And when he came back, I was like, motherfucker, yeah. And I gotta say, I'm really proud that Solomon was man enough to admit, most of this is my fault. I fucked up. I led everyone to this particular point, because he wasn't a perfect ruler. He wasn't. Ultimately, he made huge mistakes. I guess to a certain degree you could call it arrogance, because he felt like him taking God out of its seat and basically becoming God itself was the best action, the best course of action, and ultimately it failed miserably. But the fact that he was man enough to admit he was wrong makes him more of a grounded person. You could definitely see that there's flaws to him, and it shows that he's human. And I think that while it doesn't make him a perfect guy, and it doesn't make him like, oh my god, this being, ultimately that's a lot of times why you shouldn't see these heroes that we hear of. That's why really you shouldn't see, like, for example, you go to like Naruto, that's why you shouldn't see the fourth Hokage ever, or the Sage of Six Paths ever, because regardless of how they write them, ultimately you're going to see them as, oh, they're not as cool as I thought they would be, because ultimately you're supposed to just idolize them from afar, I feel. And that's why seeing Solomon, people are going to look at him like, oh, he's not as awesome as I thought he was going to be. He made mistakes. He kind of got arrogant. But to me, I feel as though that humanizes the character. That gives him qualities of actually a quality ruler, because ultimately he did fuck up, but he was man enough to admit that he made those wrongs and try and come back and fix anything he possibly could. A little too late in my opinion. I mean, at the end of the day, Sheba bought the big one without him there, but yeah. And honestly, one of the only things I could really say about this chapter is mainly it felt very rushed, and that's honestly par for the course for what would be, I guess, probably the third half of this entire arc. It just really felt rushed. In this chapter, a lot of things felt very unclear, and I'm imagining what Shinobu's probably going to do later down the road is we're going to get more explanations on this as time progresses, and people, stop feeling like, oh, we've been in Almatron forever. And it just really annoys me when arc gets really rushed like this. Like, looking back, yeah, I wasn't the most patient either, but I'd much rather be a little bit bored or feeling that it's a little bit slow than ultimately get the pacing that we got in this week's chapter. Because when manga do these things, again, like going back to, like, recently Bleach did something like this where it skipped fights and it just immediately skipped to more interesting bits, or Naruto did this during the Obito flashback. Regardless of how people are receiving it, ultimately I think it's the best option to let the writer finish the way he wanted to do it, because ultimately then it just becomes something rushed and kind of fucks with the story a bit and the flow of how things were going. Also shows as well, though, for people that are kind of doubting Solomon as a leader, everyone, even though they also acknowledge, yeah, he did fuck up, all the species were still standing behind him and saying, yo, we're ride or die with you. We're going to the very end. And I think that that's absolutely showing just how incredible of a presence, for that matter, that Solomon had, that even after everything, they're there staring down all these black jinn, and, they're probably fearing for their lives, some of them. Ultimately, they're still like, yo, Solomon, you're the leader. You're the one that's going to lead us to the promised land. we're going to go with you to the end. But then shortly after that point, that's where it just started to go super rushed. I mean, we start getting narration from, I believe, Ugo. At first I thought it was Aladdin, but then you see later on that it's kind of connecting with some things Ugo's saying. So I don't know if it was vice versa, both of them, or ultimately that was just the remainder of the dialogue that was there as far as the narration was from Ugo. Although I would imagine that at least certain portions probably is Aladdin explaining the finale, because he does say that all the chiefs of the species were basically turned into jinn by Solomon and Ugo's magic. So I'd imagine at certain portions it is Aladdin explaining, you know, the finale of what happened. That's where it started to just feel really rushed. It's like we didn't even get to see how they did it or what happened. This should have been way longer. And it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. People really want to see Aladdin that bad. I don't think that the cost of, you know, rushing things is worth getting back to Aladdin and Sinbad ass and all that shit, because I love all those characters, you know, to death. Of course, they're some of my favorite characters. But ultimately, this cast of characters wasn't a bad cast either. So I don't know. I mean, it is what it is. It sucks, but they got rushed. And it also shows that even Solomon, as a fucked up old man for a bit, he ultimately was still able to overwhelm. I mean, they didn't prepare for this because they had no idea Solomon would be there. So him and the other species were actually at a certain point. And again, this goes back to Solomon is a beast, regardless of what you want to say. He was able to help and overwhelm them. For a moment, they were basically like, fuck, we can't do shit. You know, we only got these a few black jinn left. What are we going to do? So Solomon, even for a moment, he was still like as beastly as ever. And then it kind of got a little bit weird where you start to see him. I don't know if that's the rook of him and it's kind of being metaphoric of like the true Solomon versus Arba. I don't really know. It just, again, too rushed to even understand some of these things. But ultimately you see like the young Solomon and he's kind of like, wow, you couldn't forgive me even till the end. So it's like you could just feel the rushness in it, unfortunately, because like there should have been a lot more content in between when Solomon, you know, did the thing of basically going into God and then him reuniting with Arba for this particular fight. Because otherwise, like, if we would have had it in a different scenario, it would have felt like, damn, you know, it's been a while and they're clashing again. And in retrospect, to a small degree, I feel some sympathy for Wahid, Phelan, and even Ethnon. Fuck Arba. You know, Arba, I don't give a fuck. But I feel some sympathy for them, especially what Wahid did on some Piccolo shit in front of his wife and then saying that he ultimately wants to see his son now. To me, it looked as though Wahid's sacrifice and turning into the Rook ultimately helped to summon Il-Elah or the medium or whatever it was at that particular point, and it came and fucked everything up. But him saying that he wanted to go see Tess, I'd imagine one of the things is his strong emotion for wanting to see his son and the amount of, I guess, Black Rook within him, the enormous fall into depravity, was what was able to summon Il-Elah completely and just start fucking everything up. And I mean, it almost killed the entire world at that particular point. So it makes me wonder, could Wahid be a part of the medium? Because he said he was going to search for his son inside of Il-Elah now, or he was going to go see his son or something like that. So it makes you wonder, was he the medium? Was his consciousness the medium in the Magnestot War? Or what's up with that? I'd imagine he's in there, but I don't know necessarily if he was the full consciousness of the medium, because at the end of the day, the medium was pretty retarded, and Wahid, while he liked jugs, he wasn't retarded. And then this is the part I was talking about where it feels like Ugo was narrating now. First it was Aladdin, now Ugo, because then Ugo says, these were the last words I ever heard from King Solomon, where he told him, create the new world. You are the strongest magician. And that really showed their bond as well, kind of tying back into when he was constantly trying to reaffirm Ugo and get his confidence back up. It's like, no, bro, you are the strongest. Even though, to me, in my opinion, Ugo's the smartest by far. Strongest, I don't know. I wouldn't go that far, because, I mean, look at Solomon. He came and he fucking still was owning Arba, and all of them, even after being in the Root for so long and not having even a regular body, he came into this vegetable body. But one of the most interesting things about this chapter was Arba saying that this voice was guiding her. She's only listening to this voice in her head, and the only voice I could think of is either two voices. Il-Elah itself, she's been so fucked in the head that she's the only one, because she just worshipped this shit so much that she can only hear him. Or goes back to King David. Now, back in the cathedral, we saw her try to kill him with no mercy. You know, it was just like stabbing him straight through the mouth. Was that a facade? Did she already know that that wasn't him, and that's why she did it, just to keep up the front? Has she been David's puppet this entire time? Does this all go back to King David really is ruling everything, and he just has her as his mindless slave, so to speak, or he's just constantly whispering in her ear, and she might think that it's Il-Elah, but it's really David? And I think that that's kind of confirming that some given point we will get more on Arba's backstory, more on Gyokuen for that matter, because it seems as though we might have one more chapter after this, kind of just showing Ugo and Aladdin before, you know, right before Magi started. But ultimately, we might get more on Gyokuen maybe finding out just the Rook either possessed her body, because at some given point, she was seemingly in the flashbacks a good mother to everybody, Hakuryu and all them, but then something went wrong and she just went from like a decent mother to like killing and everything. So did the Root go into bodies and possess bodies, and that's why the birthmark is there, and she kind of looks a little bit different from the Arbor from our timeline? But it's also kind of confusing because there are a couple people that make it from Almataran to this world, such as Ethnon, so it really makes you wonder just how the fuck did they get to this world? Was it people that were basically mirror versions of themselves and they ultimately were able to corrupt them with their Rook and possess their bodies? Maybe the Ethnon of this world wasn't actually even bad. Maybe it was the Ethnon from Almataran came with his black Rook and infected the Ethnon of this world, because again, remember how Aladdin explained it? It was kind of like mirror worlds overlapping. And then at the end, Arbor gave one last fuck you, saying, even this fake world, I'm gonna go, even if it's just my consciousness, and fuck it all up and everything. So ultimately, very confusing towards the end. A lot of things just kind of felt a little bit like, huh, and that's definitely due to ultimately being rushed. But it was still nonetheless very interesting as always. I mean, some of the things that Arbor said about this voice whispering in her head, and just kind of makes you wonder what the hell happened for all these people to make it to the other side. It's almost as if the entire time it was David whispering in her ear and making her think that it was actually Il-Ela when it was really him. And it looks as though at the end everything is moving to the other side. I'm guessing that that's the other side, the other world. So in a sense, it almost seems as though Ugo is the god of our world at this particular point. It's almost as if that's why he needed to keep his head. It makes me curious. If Ugo dies, let's just say somebody finally gets through his dungeon and they squash his head or just kill him in general, would that make the entire world, our world, disappear? Are we nothing more than a figment of Ugo's imagination? Definitely very interesting. Overall, it was a good chapter, very good chapter. I'm torn between 7.5 to an 8. It was good to very good. The rush and the ultimate confusion towards the end and a lot of unclear things makes me really hopeful that Shinobu will explain this in greater detail later on, especially Arba's backstory a little bit further, you know, David's connection, if any at all, to Arba's fucked up ways. Ultimately, I'm glad Solomon came back from the Root to, you know, do what he needed to do. The biggest problem, honestly, was that it felt rushed, but aside from that, very interesting yet again. And it's just like, holy shit, Arba to the very fucking end, she wanted to destroy everything, all in the name of God. Let me know what you think. A lot of questions is why the medium, was he controlling the medium at that particular point? Also, was Ren Gyokuen basically infected by Arba's Rook? Was she like a mirror version of Arba, and that's how she was able to ultimately change her and control her? Aladdin, basically, seemingly, Ugo will be his father, and that's probably why he's so chibi. Or Aladdin might be older than we even believe. Maybe he might be actually like 20 or 30 or some shit, but the way he was, you know, born and everything, and the magic that his mother put on him keeps him little. And a lot of the confusions at the end of the chapter, can you make sense of any of these weird things that happened? Was it David whispering in Arba's ear? Just what the fuck was going on at the end? Definitely really wish that it wasn't rushed towards the end. So yeah, 7.5 to an 8 around there, I'd give it. But that's all I have for this review. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked anything I had to say or enjoyed the video, drop me a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so as well, that'd be awesome. I'm from that world, and as always, people, have an awesome day. I guess Solomon wants to come from the Rook and listen to me last week when I said, you better do something next week, because this week he sure as hell did. He came back and he was like, yo, Arba, bitch, it's time to put you down. So definitely I gotta say, first of all, I felt a lot of responsibility was put on the shoulders of Ugo after the events of everything that went down in this arc, because if you look at it, first of all, in the beginning of this chapter, he was trusted with baby Aladdin. He's not even like, you know, formed or anything yet. He's just a tiny little jizz specimen, you know, he's a little embryo or whatever. So already being trusted with the life of the child of King Solomon himself, and Sheba, one of his longtime friends, you know, looked at her probably as a little sister or something. So he was already put with that responsibility. But then at the end, when Solomon trusts him to create the new world and do all these things, it's like, I feel for Ugo, because at the end of the day,